Good afternoon. This hearing of the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights will come to order. Today's hearing is entitled Reassessing Solitary Confinement, Part 2, the Human Rights, Fiscal, and Public Safety Consequences. In a moment, I'll make an opening statement, and then I'll recognize Senator Cruz when he arrives as the subcommittee ranking member for his opening statement. Thank you to those who are here in person and those following the hearing on Facebook, Twitter, and using the hashtag Solitary. There was so much interest in today's hearing that we moved to this larger room to accommodate everyone. If someone can't get a seat in the hearing room, we have an overflow room in 226 Dirksen. I also want to note that if you look around the hearing room today, you'll see a number of pictures of children during the course of this hearing who are being held in solitary confinement. I want to thank the photographer, Richard Ross, for allowing us to use these photos. This subcommittee has worked to address human rights issues around the world, as we did with our hearing last month on the Syrian refugee crisis, and we have an obligation to honestly consider our own human rights record at home. The United States has the highest per capita rate of incarceration in the world. With 5% of the world's population, we have close to 25% of its prisoners. African Americans and Hispanic Americans are incarcerated at much higher rates than whites. And the United States holds more prisoners in solitary confinement than any other democratic nation. These are human rights issues that we cannot ignore. Congress has been unable to find common ground on many important issues, but criminal justice reform is one area where we can show the American people that our government still functions. Just a few weeks ago, we have made some progress. In 2010, Congress unanimously passed the Fair Sentencing Act, bipartisan legislation that I co-authored with Senator Jeff Sessions that greatly reduced the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. And just a few weeks ago, the Judiciary Committee reported the Smarter Sentencing Act, bipartisan legislation that I've introduced with Senator Mike Lee of Utah that would reform federal drug sentencing and focus law enforcement resources on the most serious offenders. I want to thank my ranking member for co-sponsoring that Smarter Sentencing Act as well. I also want to thank Senator Cruz for his bipartisan cooperation on putting this hearing together today. Almost 2 years ago, this subcommittee held the first ever congressional hearing on solitary confinement. We heard testimony about the dramatic increase in the use of solitary confinement that began in the 1980s. We learned that vulnerable groups like immigrants, children, sex abuse victims, and individuals with serious and persistent mental illness are often held in isolation for long periods of time. We heard about the serious fiscal impact of solitary confinement. It costs almost 3 times as much to keep a federal prisoner in segregation than in the general population. And we learned about the human impact of holding tens of thousands of men, women, and children in small, windowless cells 23 hours a day, for days, for months, and for years, with very little, if any, contact with the outside world. This extreme isolation can have serious psychological impacts on an inmate. According to several studies, at least half of all prison suicides occur in solitary confinement. And I'll never forget the testimony in our last hearing of Anthony Graves, who was held in solitary for 10 of his 18 years in prison before he was exonerated. Mr. Graves told this subcommittee, and I quote, "No one can begin to imagine the psychological effects isolation has on another human being. Solitary confinement does one thing. It breaks a man's will to live." Now, I've been chairman of the subcommittee for 7 years. I cannot remember more compelling testimony. At the last hearing, we heard from Director of the Bureau of Prisons, Charles Samuels, who's with us again today. I wasn't particularly happy with the testimony at the last hearing, and I think I've made that clear to Mr. Samuels, but I do want to commend him and his team because they heard the message of our first hearing. At my request, Mr. Samuels agreed to the first ever independent assessment of our federal prison solitary confinement policy and practice. This assessment is underway, and I'll look forward to an update today from Mr. Samuels, who's with us. At our 2012 hearing, we found that the overuse of solitary can present a serious threat to public safety, increasing violence inside and outside prisons. The reality is that the vast majority of prisoners held in isolation will be released someday. the damaging impact of their time in solitary or their release directly from solitary can make them a danger to themselves and their neighbors. I want to note this is the one-year anniversary of the tragic death of Federal Correctional Officer Eric Williams, who was killed by an inmate in a high-security prison in Pennsylvania. We owe it to correctional officers who put their lives on the line every day to do everything we can to protect their safety. Make no mistake, that means that some dangerous inmates must be held in segregated housing. But we also learn from states like Maine and Mississippi, which have reduced violence in prisons by reducing the overuse of solitary. I made a personal visit to a prison now basically closed in Illinois called TAMS. TAMS was our state maximum security prison. I asked that they take me to the worst of the worst, the most dangerous inmates, and they took me to an area with 5 prisoners. They happened to be going through some unusual classroom experience while I was there, which I never quite understood, but each of the prisoners was in a separate fiberglass unit, protected from one another and from the teacher. And I walked to each of them and spoke to them, trying to get an understanding of who they were and why they were there and how they perceived their situation. It was much different for each one of them, but there's one in particular that I remember. He looked to be a community college professor, a clean-cut young man. And I asked him, well, how long are you sentenced to prison? He said, originally 20 years. And I said, originally? Yes, he said, they added another 50 years. And I said, why? He says, because I told him if they put anybody in a cell with me, I would kill him, and I did. Now that's the reality of prison life in the most extreme circumstance. I know that we want to make certain that those who work in prisons and those who also are prisoners are safe, and we've got to balance that against our concerns about humane treatment of those in solitary confinement. We must address the overcrowding crisis in federal prisons that made prisons more dangerous and dramatically increased the inmate to correctional officer ratio. That's one important reason I want to pass the Smarter Sentencing Act, which will significantly reduce prison overcrowding by inmates who've committed nonviolent drug offenses. And it's one reason I'm working to open a Thompson Correctional Center in my own state. I look forward to working with the Bureau of Federal Prisons to ensure that Thompson helps to alleviate overcrowding and that all prisoners held there are treated appropriately and humanely. Let me say a word about a especially vulnerable group, children. According to the Justice Department, 35% of juveniles in custody report being held in solitary confinement for some time. 35%. The mental health effects of even short periods of isolation, including depression and risk of suicide, are heightened among youth. That's why the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry has called for a ban on solitary for children under 18. At our first hearing, we heard about many promising reform efforts at the state level. As is so often the case, state governments continue to lead the way. Let's take a few examples. Last year, my own state of Illinois closed the TAMS Correctional Center, which I mentioned earlier, relocating the remaining prisoners to other facilities. In the ranking member's home state of Texas, the state legislature last year passed legislation requiring an independent commission to conduct a comprehensive review of the use of solitary confinement in state prisons and jails. And New York has just announced sweeping reforms that will greatly limit the use of solitary confinement for juveniles and pregnant women. There have been other positive developments since our first hearing. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement issued important guidance limiting the use of solitary confinement for immigration detainees. This is a positive step for some of the most vulnerable individuals in detention. I want to thank ICE for this effort. And the American Psychiatric Association issued a policy statement opposing the prolonged isolation of individuals with serious mental illness. More must be done. That's why today I'm calling for all federal and state facilities to end the use of solitary confinement for juveniles, pregnant women, and individuals with serious and persistent mental illness, except in the rarest of circumstances. By reforming our solitary confinement practices, the United States can protect human rights, improve public safety, and be fiscally responsible. It is the right and smart thing to do, and the American people deserve no less. Senator Cruz has not arrived yet, so I'm going to turn to our first witness. And as I mentioned earlier, Senator Cruz and I agreed on a bipartisan basis on all of today's witnesses. I want to note that I invited the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to participate in today's hearing, but unfortunately they declined. We will be following up with them to make them aware of our hearing and to ensure they are enforcing the federal civil rights laws that protect prisoners held in solitary confinement. Also at this time, I ask unanimous consent to enter into record the written testimony of Kevin Landy of the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Without objection, it will be included. Our first witness today is Charles Samuels, Director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Director Samuels, you're going to have 5 minutes for an opening statement, and your complete written statement will be included in the record. And if you will please stand and raise your right hand to be sworn, as is the custom of this committee.